Donald Trump.
Breaking news tonight, former President Donald Trump claiming innocence after his second indictment. Trump is the first former U.S. president to face federal charges.
And this evening, Trump revealed he will surrender to authorities on Tuesday. Let's get right to our John Kipper, who is getting reaction from St. Louisans tonight. John?
Yeah, we've heard from several St. Louis area elected officials tonight with predictable responses. But we also spoke with over 24 people outside a shopping mall parking lot tonight, asking people what they make of the indictment. And almost nobody seemed to have an opinion, except one woman.
I'm quite over it. You know, I mean, if they're going to indict him for something, they need to produce evidence and not just words.
Rachel Fisher says she's tired of the constant barrage of attacks on former President Donald Trump. For her, the evidence doesn't pass the smell test.
I think everybody's getting sick of it. I'm sick of it, and everybody I know is sick of it.
Trump said Thursday the Department of Justice indicted him over his handling of sensitive government documents. Sources tell CBS News the multi-count indictment is connected to the allegedly unlawful retention of national defense information and obstruction of government efforts to retrieve them. Trump posted on social media Thursday, saying he's been ordered to appear at a federal courthouse next Tuesday, then released this video.
It's a hoax. The whole thing is a hoax. Just like Russia, just like the fake dossier was a hoax.
The former president denies any wrongdoing in this case.
There's really not much legally that could potentially help him by saying this is going to happen. I mean, all of this is political. All of this is so that he can frame the narrative. We can hear it from him first, and his supporters will continue to be told this is a witch hunt. This is all the political weaponization of the Department of Justice.
Missouri U.S. Senator Josh Hawley, a Republican and Trump ally, went after President Joe Biden's administration in his response, tweeting, "Joe Biden has used his Justice Department to go after parents as domestic terrorists, to spy on Catholic parishes, to terrorize and harass pro-life Christians, and tonight to indict his top political opponent, Trump. He has trampled the rule of law to benefit himself. He has led the country into profound danger." On the other side of the political aisle, Missouri Congresswoman Cori Bush, a Democrat, went directly after Trump, tweeting, "The former white supremacist in chief has been indicted on federal charges. He must be held accountable." Fisher remains very skeptical of the indictment, but wasn't necessarily going all in that Trump is innocent.
Produce the evidence. If the evidence is there, let it happen.
Now, we saw Senator Hawley's response to the indictment. We're still waiting on responses from two of his potential opponents, Democrats Lucas Kuntz and St. Louis County Prosecuting Attorney Wesley Bell. Reporting live, John Kipper, News 4.